if you've ever tried to plan your life, one thing you should have learned by now is that we don't control anything, do we? I'm sure many of you have been in situations where you planned a certain career, a certain college, a certain person to marry, and those plans just kind of got demolished as you were endeavoring to live them out. And you don't want to start off with putting us all in a bad place mentally, but honestly, we can say that we're all just one phone call, one text message away from a really, really, really bad day. Just one phone call away from disaster. And all of our plans, all of our desires, all of our hopes and dreams, they often just kind of crumble around us, don't they? The truth is, if we live long enough, each one of us is going to face difficulties and disappointments in life. Some of you have already faced those. Some of you are maybe kind of young, and you will face them. All of us face them. No one gets left out. No one is immune to difficulties and disappointments. So the question then is, when stress and pressure come, the question isn't, are you going to face it? We know we will face it. The question is, what are we going to do when it comes? How do we respond when stresses and pressures and difficulties and just a bad day come our way? Do we just isolate and go hide somewhere? And how do we walk through this? How do we make it through to the other side? And Psalm 55 is where we're at. Some of you have already turned there, but Psalm 55 is possibly the most stressful time in David's life. And David's been through a lot of things in his life, if we'd go back and read it, but this is quite possibly his writings of the most difficult thing he's ever faced. And he's facing something far more heart-wrenching than when Saul turned on him and sought to kill him and he had to flee and hide. He's facing something that's even more difficult than that. And so before we jump into the verses of Psalm 55, let's get some context of what's taking place here. And I just want to encourage you, when you do read the Psalms, that it's always good to go back and read the historical texts that coincide with them. The Psalms are written and they're all put together in one book, but each one of them was written during a different period in history that we can often find in the book of Samuel's or the Chronicles or the Kings. And so for those of you that are following along in our daily reading plan that we've been doing this year, you're familiar with this. You've probably seen this because we've been reading the Bible chronologically. And in fact, over the last few weeks and the last several days, we have been in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And if you've noticed, that chronological reading plan that we are in has intertwined many of the Psalms in the places where they fit in those books. And so you'll probably recognize the context that we're going to talk about today, building up to Psalm 55, because it's something that we just recently read in the last few days or in the last few weeks. So we find the context of Psalm 55 in 2 Samuel 15 through 17. And you don't have to turn there. You can if you want. We're not going to read all three of those chapters. But we find the context, the thing that builds us up, to explains to us what's going on in Psalm 55 in those three chapters of 2 Samuel, chapters 15, 16, and 17. So just to kind of summarize what's taking place and build context before we jump into Psalm today, is we find in this place that David is a legendary soldier at this point. He has gone into many battles and he has won many battles. He has come out victorious. We also find that he now is the king of Israel. He's no longer hiding in caves and running from conflict with Saul and Saul's people. Saul is long gone by now, and David is the king, and he's quite possibly, he's very powerful, but he's quite possibly the most powerful person we know in Israel at this time, but maybe even in this region because of his great leadership skills in battle. He's also very wealthy at this point. This little shepherd boy that went from tending his father's sheep is now the king of Israel, and he's wealthy. And I don't know if it's a good thing to point out or not, but he has many wives, and we'll just leave that there and go on. And up until now, up until this place that we're at, things have been going pretty good for David. Things have been going very well. But David gets blindsided by something. And if you read David's life, for all the good that there is, for even in the fact that he is called a man after God's own heart, there's some things about David that maybe weren't so good. David most likely was not winning Daddy of the Year awards. We can look and see that there's times where David he wasn't very good as a husband or as a father. For all the good that we do find in David, this is an area where he was lacking. And so we find in these chapters in 2 Samuel that David had a daughter named Tamar. And Tamar's brother, Absalom, was very angry about an incestuous situation involving Tamar and one of their half-brothers. And Absalom was mad at David because he didn't feel that David did enough he didn't deal harshly enough with this other brother of theirs. And so Absalom decides that he's going to deal with this on his own. And so he puts some plans together, and he deals with it himself, and he kills their brother from another mother. And so Absalom is kind of somewhat banished and exiled. We find him leaving Jerusalem, leaving the home of David, and he spends some time in exile, but eventually he's allowed to return home. And even though he returns home, the relationship between David and Absalom, it never quite heals. It never really gets bonded. And Absalom plans and plots a coup against his father, the king. And so the way he does this is he stands at the city gates and he talks himself into the hearts of the people. And doing so, he divides them and divides their allegiances between good old dad and himself. And so now there's a division among the people of Israel, and some of them are loyal to David, but many of them are won over by Absalom, his cunning, his talking, his manipulating, and it mentions that he's probably the best-looking guy in Israel. And so he's able to sway a good group of people to follow him. And so David's caught completely off guard by this. He's not aware that any of this has taken place, but maybe what stings worse than the betrayal of his estranged son is that David's closest friend and advisor, Ahithophel, is playing both sides of the net, so to speak. He's being a double agent. He's like with Absalom, and you're good, you're awesome, you're great, and then he's with David, and he's backing up David, and he's kind of playing a double agent here, but he ends up tagging along on the coattails of Absalom. And he does this maybe because he recognizes that the power that Absalom has received, that he has been granted, and he realizes that this is the direction for the future of Israel. And so maybe I better place my allegiances with the one who seemingly has the most power at the moment. And so by the time David kind of wakes up and smells the coffee and realizes that all this is going on, Absalom has went to Hebron, and he's manipulated himself into being anointed as king. Now, I thought David was king, but but this shows the following that Absalom has, and that he has manipulated the circumstances and gotten himself anointed as king. And then as David is finding out about this, he also finds out that Absalom is heading towards Jerusalem with a great army in an effort to overthrow and to kill David because of this anger and this unsettled resentment that Absalom has against his dad. And so all of us, I'm sure, have experienced a bad day here or there, but I don't know if any of us have experienced a your son is coming to kill you bad day. And that's what David is facing in this moment. So David grabs a few loyal friends, followers, family, and he flees his house, he flees his throne, and he flees his kingdom. He realizes that he better head out because there's a great army coming with Absalom. And so as they're leaving Jerusalem, David is ascending the Mount of Olives, and it says that he's weeping, he's barefoot, and he has his head covered. And this doesn't just mean that he's wearing a Jewish hoodie. It's that when his head is covered, it's letting us know that this is a sign that he is suffering great grief and mourning. And the others around him recognize what he's going through. And the scriptures tell us that they also covered their heads to show solidarity with their king. And so some scholars believe that Psalm 55 is David's prayer in this time of great stress and despair, of stress and pressure. And so as we look at the 55th Psalm, we'll see a few things. First, we're going to see the process that stress and pressure takes David through. And as we look through this, we'll see four things that this stress and this pressure lead him into. And then after that, starting in verse 16, we'll see the proper response to stress and pressure. And so the first phase of this process that David faces is frustration. So if you look with me to Psalm 55, we'll look at verses 1 and 2 to start off with. And David says, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan." That phrase, "I am restless in my complaint, and I moan." The New American Standard, instead of moan, it says, "and I am surely distracted." Well, we would probably think so, right? This is taking place in real time. We're reading it a few thousand years down the road, but to David, this is happening right now in real time. This is a live event. And so he's so frustrated that all he can do is talk and complain and gripe, and he can't focus. It says that I am surely distracted. He can't focus. He's trying to figure everything out, but he can't pull his thoughts together. You can imagine that the thoughts, why did this happen? How did it happen? I didn't even see this coming. When did all this take place? When did these men back my son and form an army against me? I wasn't even aware there was an issue. And so all this stuff is going through his mind, and he can't focus on anything. We see that a little clearer in the next few verses. In verses 3 through 5, it says, "Because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they drop trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me." You get the idea that this stuff is going through his mind at 100 miles per hour, and he can't pull his thoughts together. He can't form together any rational thoughts in which to set down and even come up with one answer to the many questions that he's asking. Then his frustration leads to the second phase that we see in this, and that's isolation. In Psalm 55, verses 6 through 8, he says, "And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Yes, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness, Selah. Now, I want to stop right there for a minute, because the way I read that to you is the way we probably typically read that. We think David saying, oh, if I had wings, I would just fly into heaven and be with God. That's not what David's doing here. He's saying, oh, if I had wings like a dove, I would fly away from this place. I would be at rest. I would go far, and I would lodge in the wilderness. Not in the castle, not in the temple, not in my home, in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and tempest. He's saying, I'd get out of here. If I had wings, I'd get out of here. I'd leave all of you and just go somewhere to be alone. And have you ever been there in any of your times of stress or pressure, that things just seem so bad that you would just get in the car and drive until you couldn't drive any further? You're out of gas or the tires run off of the car. You wouldn't pack anything. You wouldn't take anybody with you, not your wife, your kids, your dog. Well, you might take your dog. Some of you probably have more loyalty to your dog than to your wife and kids, but you just want to go somewhere else and start over, just to escape the situation that's at hand. Oh, if I had wings, I would just go and get away. And then he realizes something, that he actually is away. He's not where he's supposed to be, thanks to Absalom and Ahithophel, his supposed friend. And then isolation, which many of us seek when we're facing times of despair, just to get away, just to withdraw, just to not have to see anybody. But this isolation leads him to the next phase that we'll call retribution. It's anger. He goes from frustration to seeking isolation to now there is anger welling up inside of him. And this is where we have to be careful, because this is where stress and pressure turn really ugly really quick. This stuff gets into his heart, and then the rage and anger begin to flow out. In verse 9, he says, "Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city." And then if we skip down to verse 15, he kind of takes this to the edge, if not crossing the line. He says, "Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is in their dwelling place and in their hearts." What did David just ask God to do? David asked God to send him to hell. And Sheol was the place of the departed spirits. And he's saying, God, send them there alive. Send them to hell. David, he says, you know, I probably should have handled things a little better back when I had the chance, but who do you think you are, Absalom? You want to come and take what is mine and kill me? God, send them to hell. That's what comes out of David's mouth, because that's what comes out of his heart. And anger and rage will cause the man after God's own heart to turn into the heart that is ungodly. We have to be careful that in our moments of despair and in our moments of stress and in our moments of pressure, that we don't find ourselves in a place where a godly heart turns into an ungodly heart. And then we begin to wish things on people that are ugly and not after the heart of God. There's a righteous anger for sure, but left unchecked, righteous anger can turn into an anger that sins really, really quickly. And so his frustration, his isolation, his retribution sets him up for the next phase of this process, and that's humiliation. This whole thing has been humiliating for David. Wouldn't it you? He says, how could I have been so blind? Man, how can I be so stupid? Why would I give my heart? Why would I give my trust to somebody knowing that this could happen? And he's frustrated, he's isolated, he's angry, and he's humiliated by the way that this has played out. And look at this. It's bad enough that his own son is coming to kill him. But it seems that the true source of David's pain is wrapped up in Ahithophel. We'll see that as we read. Ahithophel's, say that a lot of times. Ahithophel isn't mentioned by name here in this psalm, but I believe that he is strongly alluded to. Let's look at let's start in verse 12. He says, "For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It's not an adversary who deals insolently with me, then I can hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house, we walked in the throng." He says, but it is you. And you kind of have to wonder, sometimes we don't know tone from text. And it could be accusatory, but it is you. Or he could still be in this moment of confusion. But it's you. It's not an enemy. It's you, my familiar friend. You pick up on the sense that David was blindsided by this betrayal. And the you here isn't Absalom. And there's a couple reasons we know that or we believe that. First of all, David is caught completely off guard. But David could have seen that one coming. I mean, maybe we know that he's not aware that Absalom is turning people against him and he's building an army. But there's some strife still within the house. David won't even speak to Absalom in the home. And so you can maybe see that. But then he says, a man my equal. In Jewish culture at that time, you would have never put your child as your equal. Your children are always subservient under you. And so we know he's not speaking about Absalom here. He's speaking about somebody else that he considered somebody on equal ground with him. And he's the king. Nobody's on equal ground with the king. But there's somebody that David has entrusted himself to. He says, you went with me where my family didn't even go. You knew every word that was spoken in all those private meetings that we had. You know practically everything about me. No one speaks freely to the king. No one just says what they think to the king. But I called you in and sought your counsel. And so you get this idea that David is just heartbroken, that he is in grief over this. It says that they walked in the house of God in the throng. And Psalm 42:4, if you want to write that down and read it a little bit later, it has similar wording, and what it does, it hints to the idea that Ahithophel, as being with David, as David led the people in a procession to the temple for times of worship during the holy days and the holy festivals. It's like, man, you were always by my side. You were my right-hand man. Even going into the times of worship, you were right there with me. And some of you know, and as I do, that there's no betrayal quite like the betrayal of a close and trusted friend. That's one that is hard to get over, if you ever do. And this is what David is feeling as he writes these words in what we call Psalm chapter 55. He is in grief. He's mortified. And then there's somewhat of a transition here, as there often is in the Psalms written by David. So here is David in quite possibly the most stressful period of his life. And although we all face our own stressful and pressure-filled events in life, none of us can say that we know exactly what David is feeling here right now. And maybe some of you, your family dynamic, you feel close to what he's feeling. But David is a mess right now. And just when we think that David is on the verge of a breakdown, as we often find him, it's like a switch flips between verse 15 and verse 16. And we sometimes jokingly kind of read the Psalms and we say that David has some signs there of bipolar, and not that bipolar being bipolar and bipolar disorder are things to joke about, but we see this over and over, that he's up 1 minute and then he's down the next. Or he's pessimistic for 10 verses and then all of a sudden he's optimistic for the next 5. And so we see this over and over and over in David. But I think what takes place here, and what takes place many of the times in David's writing, it's not just that there's some disorder and he can't decide if he's happy or sad, but I think what really happens is that David remembers some things. Oh God, I remember when you gave me strength to kill the lion and the bear who were attacking my sheep. And I remember that giant who stood against the armies of your people. And you delivered that wretched, foul Goliath into my hands. Oh, when Saul sought to kill me, when he was chasing me, when he was hunting me down, you hid me from his sight. And maybe with all that in mind, David does 3 things. And these are 3 things that you and I also have to do when we feel like the world is just crumbling beneath our feet. Look at verse 16. First of all, before we get into these 3 things, we see this change, we see this transition. The first 2 words, but I. Notice the change in focus here. Because up until now it's been, they did, he said, this was done to me. Okay, we know what they did. The important question is, what are you going to do? The question changes from, why did this happen, to, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? How am I going to react to what's taking place around me? And so if we read on in verse 16, he says, but I call to God, and the Lord will save me. So the first thing we do when we find ourselves in a situation similar to David's, when the world seems to be falling apart around us, is we call to God. He says, I call to God. Why? Why do we call to God? Why did David call to God? Because he remembers and he recognizes and he knows that God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, that God is in control of all things, because we know that we are in control of nothing, but God is in control of everything. And so we're down here fretting. This is going on around us, and we can't get our thoughts together, and we're frustrated, and we're mad, and we're humiliated, and we're just fretting over the whole thing. Our hair's falling out, we're losing weight, and God's not anxious one bit. He's not shaken by our circumstance. That doesn't mean that he doesn't care, but he doesn't get anxious. He doesn't feel that everything's out of control for him. We may lack information and we're not sure what to do, but God has all of the information. He knows all the bits and pieces of how everything is laid out. He knows the chess pieces on the board, and he knows what to do. He knows how to move them. He knows how to put everything back in order. And so we trust the goodness and we trust the sovereignty of God. When everything seems to be falling apart, we call out to God because we trust God, because we know that he is sovereign, because we know that he is in control. And then the second thing that David does, and the second thing that we should do, is we wait for the salvation of God. Look, he says, I call to God, and the Lord will save me. God is always in tune with the human predicament. He is always in tune as to what is going on in your life. Every bump of the toe, every betrayal of a friend or family member, every illness, every disease, every setback, every plan that you had that fell apart, God is completely and entirely in tune with your situation. And look, he will step in. He will save. He will deliver those who are called by his name. It reminds me of 2 Chronicles, again, a verse in this same area, the same section of reading in 7:14. If my people who are called by my name, what do? Humble themselves. And do what? And pray. And what else? And seek my face. And there's another thing there. Turn from their wicked ways. Then I will hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin. And I will heal their land. But we have to be aware that there are different aspects to deliverance. We all want everything just to go away and everything to get better, but there's different aspects to deliverance. And God will either deliver us from something, he'll deliver us in something, or sometimes he'll deliver us through something. Sometimes there's stuff going on and we cry out to God for deliverance and he just reaches down and pulls us right out of the situation. That's the one we like. That's the one we all want. But sometimes he delivers us in the situation. The circumstances don't change, but he protects us and he guides us and he encourages us and he pours out his love on us. And sometimes he delivers us through something, meaning that nothing's going to change. Everything's going to stay the same. But we're going to walk through this. And I'll be there on the other side when we get there. But know this. You have to know this. God always delivers his people. God always delivers his people. Always. Always. He always delivers his people. He might not take you out of it. You might have to wait for a while as you go through it. And maybe that's because that he has all the information. Remember, he knows what's taking place. And maybe he's building something in you or he's building something through you while you wait for his deliverance. So what do you do while you wait? You call to God. And you wait on his deliverance. Notice this. We know how the story turns out. Especially if you just went through this reading plan with us. We know what takes place after this because this was in our reading a few days or just a couple weeks ago. And so we know how this turns out, but this is happening for David in real time. He doesn't have the advantage of looking ahead and saying, oh yeah, now I know how it works out. This is happening to him. He doesn't have privy to the information that you and I have. So what does David do? Not knowing what lays ahead, not knowing if God's going to deliver him out, in, or through, what does David do? He calls to God and he waits for the salvation of the Lord. And then the third thing that David does and that we do is cast your burden on the Lord. In verse 22, he says, cast your burden on the Lord and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. Those are strong words. He will sustain you. He will never permit you to be moved. The New American Standard here says he will not allow you to be shaken. You ever feel like everything's being shaken? Everything around you might be shaken, but God doesn't let you be shaken. It's like one of those snow globes. You got the little figure that's glued to the bottom, and you can shake that thing up as violently as you want, and all that glitter and all that fake snow goes all over the place, but the figure never moves. God will sustain you, and he will not permit you to be moved. My problem, and maybe it's your problem too, is when I come up against something, too many times my initial reaction is, how am I going to fix this? How am I going to get out of this? How am I going to make this right? How in the world it doesn't even seem humanly possible, and most of the time it's not. And the problem with that is that when I do that, I'm stepping into the role of God. I'm wanting to be the one who takes care of the situation. I'm wanting to be the one who sustains myself and brings salvation to my own circumstance. And if I've done wrong, if you've done wrong, we should correct it in what ability we can. But most of the time, my first and your first response should be to fall on our knees and call to God. And actually, it shouldn't be most of the time. That should be every circumstance, every event, every situation. Our first and initial response should be to fall to our knees and to call to God. And here's what we'll find. He will sustain us. How does he do that? What does that mean, that God sustains us? He causes the sun to rise in the morning, and he gives us a new day of grace. That is all we should desire, is that God's grace is new for us every day. The circumstance may still be there. The situation may still be there. It is out of my control. I can't fix it. I can't deliver myself. I can't sustain myself. But God, it's a new day. And you allow the sun to rise again, and you have given me new grace and new mercy for another day. But what about the issue? It's still there. He will deliver you. God always, always, always delivers his people. When? When? Because this has been going on for a while now. In his timing. He has all the information that you don't have. He knows how everything fits together and how everything falls into place. So what do? Wait. I'll wait. Now, waiting doesn't mean closing the blinds and crawling under the covers. That there's action to our waiting. You worship while you wait. You worship God while you wait. The circumstances are bad, but God is still good, and God is still holy. And so we worship while we wait. We dig into the Word while we wait. Oftentimes we'll find peace through the written Word of God. And please, please, please don't isolate yourself from the fellowship of your church community. That's not how you handle the stress in the situation. You actually run toward it. God has ordained the body of the church for us to equip and encourage one another. And there is nothing good that comes out of an isolated believer. Nothing. So you trust. You pray. You keep walking. It's interesting that David says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He doesn't keep moving. He doesn't just curl up under a bush and wait on God. He waits on God, but he walks through the situation that he's in, waiting on God to deliver him. You keep obeying, and you wait upon the hand of the Lord. Matthew 11, 28 through 29, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Whoever's coming up, if you go ahead and come. Look at those words of Jesus there. He didn't say that he would always take away the stress and the pressure to make everything better for us, does he? And here's what we see: is you yoke up to him and learn from him, then you will be at rest. And you will find peace, even if in the storm of stress and pressure. Some of you are facing some pretty undesirable things. Whether that's a betrayal similar to David's, some relational issue, whether that's a health situation, whether it's a setback in your finances, whether it's you had plans that you were going to do this and you were going to go here and none of that's laying out before you, call on God. He will save you. Cast your burdens on him, and he will sustain you. Yoke up to Jesus and learn from him, and you will find rest and you will find peace for your weary soul. Father, we are so glad that you are aware of everything that we face. God, when we feel like you're not watching, you're not listening, you're not seeing, God, we just have to trust and know that you have the pieces of information that we lack. God, may we know that we know that we know that you always deliver your people. God, teach us patience as we wait. Give us rest